5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to Highway of the Hidden, where the forgotten roads of history still breathe, and the night hides more than shadows. Here, the restless dead whisper in the dark, cryptids stalk the tree line, and conspiracies linger just out of sight. Every mile takes us deeper into the unknown, and every story carries a chill. So buckle up and join me as we take a ride down the highway.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Highway of the Hidden. I'm your host, Polar Bear. And on tonight's episode, we are getting into gnomes. That's right. I'm not talking about the good old-fashioned garden ones. I'm talking about the real ones. And this is an episode that I've done a lot of research on. This is a lot of videos I've been seeing. So hope y'all enjoy. Let's get into it. Night doesn't just fall out here on the highway. It settles in layers the way dust does in an abandoned room. Quiet, patient, inevitable. And when the world goes dim enough, you start noticing the small things that daylight bullies into silence. The hush under porch steps, the cold pocket of air at the base of a tree, the way a garden seems to watch you back when you stand there too long. People tell themselves the unseen is always big. Wolves in the woods, spirits in the attic, towering shapes at the edge of the headlights. But some of the oldest fears were never about something massive. Some of the oldest stories were warnings about something small enough to live right beside you without you even realizing it. Small enough to be overlooked, underestimated, laughed at, right up until the moment you stop laughing. So because of this, gnomes, if you strip away the bright hats and the lawn decor and the cartoon smiles, they were never meant to be cute. They were never meant to be collectibles. They were never meant to be harmless. They belonged to an older world, one that had no patience for pretending, a world where winter killed people, where soil decided whether you ate or starved, where a locked gate didn't keep danger out so much as it marked where danger began. In that world, a household wasn't just a building. It was a living boundary, a fragile, temporary bubble of heat and food carved out of a hostile landscape. And anything that lived near that boundary, anything that could cross it, deserved attention. Not admiration, not affection, attention. That's where the gnome begins, not as a joke, not as a mascot, but as a presence tied to the ground itself, earthborn, earth-minded, and earth-owned. The word people throw around now, gnome, has been sanded down by time, rounded off like a river stone. But the core idea behind it is older than the world, older than the tidy categories we try to use, fairy, goblin, elf, spirit. In the oldest European imagination, the world was not empty. It was crowded. Fields, forests, rivers, stones, crossroads, wells, none of it was inert. The place you live had memory, and that memory had teeth. People didn't talk about nature like it was a scenery. Nature was a system of powers, a hierarchy of presences, and you survived by learning what pleased them and what offered them, and what woke them up. So when a figure emerges in the folklore described as a small, secretive, connected to the soil and stone, living in hollows and under roots, appearing at thresholds in certain places, punishing disrespect, rewarding careful hands, that figure doesn't arrive as entertainment. It arrives as explanation. Why did the bread spoil overnight? Why did the milk sour? Why did the tools go missing and reappear somewhere impossible? Why did the cattle panic? The dog refuse the yard? The child wake up screaming about something under the floor? A modern mind wants a mechanical answer. The old mind wanted a map of invisible relationships. Gnomes were a part of that map. Picture the oldest agriculture communities, tight clusters of homes pressed up against the vast unknown before electric lights made night feel like an inconvenience. Darkness was a territory. It was a place. It was something you entered the moment the sun went down, and you were wise to behave like a guest there. In those hours, the world shrank to the radius of your firelight and beyond it. Anything could be watching, not just predators with furs and claws, predators with intentions, with rules you didn't know, with hungers that weren't satisfied by meat. Your house creaked, your roof shifted, your floor popped, your wall sighed. And if you lived close to the ground, as everyone did, you felt the truth you've probably forgotten. The earth is never fully still. Roots move, water travels, burrowing creatures work like miners in the dark. The soil breathes. Beneath any home, there is a whole hidden country of tunnels and nests and rot and growth. The gnome belongs to that country. The gnome is the idea that beneath your life, beneath your certainty, there is another set of hands. And that's why so many old stories tie these beings not to the sky, not to the sea, but to the dirt. Garden, cellars, hearths, foundations, the place where a human's world touches the raw ground. And the relationship is never simple. It's tense, respectful when it's healthy, punishing when it's not. You don't own your land in these stories. You borrow it. You rent it. You are tolerated on it. And the ones who truly belong to it, those small, stubborn presences who are said to live in hills, under stones, behind the walls, those are the original tenants. And they don't need your permission. You need theirs. People love to modernize gnomes into harmless garden statues, but that habit comes from a much later impulse, the urge to domesticate fear by turning it into decor. In older traditions, the little people weren't automatically benevolent, and they weren't automatically evil. They were local powers, tied to a place, tied to family lines, tied to boundaries and customs. A household spirit could be a blessing if you treated it right, and a curse if you broke the rules. That's the unsettling part. The rules are often simple, but they're not forgiving. Don't mock, don't steal, don't waste food, don't insult the land, don't build where you shouldn't, don't cut down certain trees, and don't pour dirty water on certain stones. Don't stomp through the garden at night like you own it. Don't leave the gate open. Don't whistle after dark. Don't talk loud near the threshold. Don't bring arrogance into a place that has survived without you for 1,000 years. And what does treated right look like in the old stories? It's never grand gestures. It's always small, humble offerings that acknowledge the invisible labor of the household. A bit of bread left out, a bowl of milk near the hearth, a portion set aside before the rest is eaten. In modern ears, it sounds like a superstition, but it reveals something deeper, an instinct to negotiate with the unknown by giving it a seat at the table. You feed what you fear. You pay what you can't fight. You show respect to what you can't see, because if the unseen has hands, it can touch your life. It can touch your sleep. It can touch your children. In the old world, brutal and practical, didn't have the luxury of believing only what it could prove. It believed what kept you cautious. Over time, different regions gave different names to the same shape in the dark. In Scandinavia, you hear about the house spirits that work at night and punish laziness. In parts of Germany and Central Europe, you hear about earth dwellers, miners of hidden treasure, guardians of underground wealth. In the Celtic lands, you hear about the good neighbors, spoken of politely because saying anything wrong could invite attention. Across the map, the details change, height, clothing, temperament, but the pattern stays the same. Small beings who are not pets, not friends, not toys. Beings who exist close to human homes and human work. Drawn to the places where humans store food, keep animals, build foundations, dig wells, plant crops, and disturb soil. Beings who seem to take a personal interest in order, clean routines, careful hands, respectful habits. Beings who represent waste, noise, arrogance. Beings who reward the disciplined and torment the careless. That's not a fairy tale. That's an old moral system wrapped in a supernatural mask. The gnome is folklore's way of saying, if you live on the land, you answer to the land. There's a reason gnomes get tangled up with mining lore as well. And it's not just because they're imagined underground. The mining world was one of the most haunted workplaces humanity ever built. Men went into the earth like surgeons cutting into flesh, and the earth didn't always let them come back out. Mines collapsed, pockets of gas suffocated crews, tunnels flooded, lamps went out. In that darkness, you could hear your own heartbeat like it belonged to someone else. You could feel the weight of tons of stones above you and understand, in a way daylight never teaches, how fragile your life really is. The idea of a subterranean being, small, tough, stubborn, native to the tunnels, made a certain kind of sense. The gnome becomes not only a household presence, but a miner's omen, a sign that the earth is awake and that the earth has eyes and that the earth might be warning you or luring you. In some stories, these beings guide miners away from dangers. In others, they mislead them. In others still, they mark a seam of rich ore like bait on a hook, because greed is the easiest way to pull a human deeper into the ground. And greed matters here, because when people talk about gnomes in the old material, there's often an uncomfortable undercurrent: treasure, hoards, buried wealth, coins that appear and vanish, gold that curses the one who takes it. The connection between gnomes and treasure isn't just a fantasy trope. It reflects a psychological truth. The earth holds resources. Humans want them. Want turns into digging, digging turns into taking, and taking turns into entitlement. And entitlement is the fastest way to offend anything tied to place. So the stories do what stories always do. They animate the land's resistance. They give it a face and a temper. They create a small guardian who can slip through cracks, who can hide in shadows, who can do the kind of petty, intimate sabotage that feels personal because it is personal. Your keys are gone, your tools are missing, your bread is moldy, your milk is spoiled, your horse won't calm down. You wake up with bruises, you swear you heard footsteps in the pantry. These aren't cinematic hauntings. They're domestic warfare. The gnome doesn't burn your house down. The gnome makes you doubt your own control over your house. And here's where it gets darker, if you let it. Because the scariest thing about the gnome isn't that it might exist. The scariest thing is what it represents. The idea that your home is not fully yours. That there is a layer of reality under your reality operating on rules you didn't vote on. Rules that don't care whether you understand them. Rules that can punish you for being thoughtless. Modern life trains us to believe we have domain. We buy property, we fence it, we install cameras, we lock doors, we light everything up, we call the police if something feels wrong. But the old stories, from a time when people knew better than to confuse possession with permission, they lived close enough to the wild to know the wild isn't impressed by paperwork. So if you go back far enough, gnomes aren't a species with a fixed biography. They're a category of presence. They are the Earth's personality in miniature form. And because they are tied to the Earth, they inherit Earth traits. Patience, stubbornness, quiet strength, slow anger. The Earth doesn't scream at you when you disrespect it. It waits. It lets you keep going. It lets you get comfortable. And then one day you step wrong and a sinkhole opens, or a tree falls, or a storm destroys what you built, or a crop fails, or an illness spreads through the animals, or something in your home turns sour again and again and again until you stop blaming coincidence and start feeling watched. Gnome stories dramatize that long patience. They teach you to fear consequences that don't arrive immediately. They teach you the dread of a delayed punishment. In a lot of older tales, you don't even see the being clearly. It's a glimpse, a shape in the corner of the eye, a little figure near the woodpile that isn't there when you look straight at it, a tiny shadow slipping behind a barrel, a set of footprints that don't match any boot in the household. When something is fully seen, it becomes containable. When it is half seen, it becomes contagious. You start scanning corners. You start listening to your house the way you listen to a stranger's footsteps behind you. Every creak becomes a message. Every missing object becomes accusation. Every spoiled meal feels like response. And that's exactly how folklore keeps people in line, by turning the home into a place you must deserve, not just occupy. Even the way gnomes are described carries that old warning. Short, yes, but not fragile. Old-faced, yes, but not weak. Sometimes bearded, sometimes rough-skinned, sometimes with eyes like wet stones, sometimes dressed like laborers, like peasants, like the kind of figure you'd expect to see working soil, stacking wood, tending animals. The imagery ties them to work, and work in these traditions is almost sacred. The household spirits hate laziness, it hates disorder, it hates arrogance. It wants the home to function as an honest unit. Everyone pulls their weight, everyone respects the food, everyone respects the tools, everyone respects the animals. If you're sloppy, if you waste, if you mock, if you brag, if you treat the land like it's dead matter instead of living territory, then you don't just invite misfortune, you invite correction. And correction in the folklore can be humiliating, it can be painful, it can be cruel. And sometimes it's not correction at all. Sometimes it's simply removal. In some older patterns, when the rules were broken too far, the spirit leaves, the luck goes with it. The household becomes cold, things stop working, animals fall ill, crops fail, and the family might never know why. Because the spirit doesn't send a letter explaining itself, it withdraws. You just get a slow unraveling. A home that used to feel protected now feels exposed. The hearth doesn't feel warm enough. The night sounds closer. The walls feel thinner. The threshold feels less like a boundary and more like an invitation. If you want to understand why gnomes persist, why they keep resurfacing in different shapes and decades, and even in modern culture as a joke that people can't stop making, it's because the idea hits something deep. It hits the anxiety that we are never fully in control of our environments, that the ground under us holds secrets, that homes can turn against us, that luck isn't random, it's relational, that if you neglect the small rituals of respect, the world doesn't always punish you with lighting and drama. Sometimes it punishes you with slow, maddening sabotage of ordinary life. And ordinary life is where people break, not in big, heroic, horror movie moments, but in the small accumulation of wrongness, the missing things, the spoiled things, the sleepless nights, the creeping sense of being out of alignment with your own space. So when you hear gnome, don't picture the lawn ornament. Picture the older silhouette, a figure close to the ground, close to the root systems and the stones, living in the hidden architecture beneath your life, a presence with a memory longer than yours, a presence that doesn't want your friendship, it wants your respect. And if you live on the land, if you plant, build, dig, take, then whether you believe in it or not, the story says you're already in a relationship with it. The question isn't whether you acknowledge that relationship. The question is whether the relationship stays quiet. Because the oldest folklore doesn't care what you believe. It cares what you do. It cares how you treat the place you live. It cares whether you remember, down in your bones, that the ground is not empty and that the smallest things are sometimes the one that stays the closest. Watching, waiting, learning the sound of your footsteps the way you learn the sound of your own. As the stories move forward through time, something changes, not in the gnome, but in the way people talk about it. A tone hardens, the humor drains out, the presence that once felt like a stern neighbor becomes something closer to a threat, and the rules surrounding it stop feeling symbolic and start feeling absolute. This is where the story stops being about luck and order and start being about punishment. Because when communities grow, when land is divided, fenced, bought, sold, and worked harder than it ever was before, the old balance fractures, the earth gets louder, and the figures tied to it grow less patient. In many older accounts, the gnome doesn't announce itself when things go wrong. It doesn't roar or glow or leave dramatic signs. It does something worse. It interferes, quietly, persistently. A door that will not stay shut no matter how often it's repaired. Footsteps heard every night at the same hour, circling the same part of the house. Tools that vanish during the workday and reappear in places no one would logically put them. Animals refusing to enter certain stalls, certain sheds, certain corners of the property, children waking up screaming, not from nightmares with monsters, but from dreams where something small stood at the edge of the bed, watching, always watching. The gnome doesn't terrorize all at once, it erodes. It makes the home unreliable. And when a home becomes unreliable, the people inside it start to break down long before anything truly violent happens. There are older rural accounts, passed down in fragments, half admitted, often prefaced with embarrassment, where the gnome is blamed, not just for inconvenience, but for physical harm. Bruises appearing on arms and legs overnight, hair tangled into painful knots while someone sleeps, a feeling of pressure on the chest, not heavy enough to suffocate, but heavy enough to remind you that you are not alone in the dark. These aren't framed as attacks so much as warnings. The tone is always the same. Someone crossed a line, and something small decided to remind them who noticed. In these stories, the punishment almost always stops once the behavior changes. The offering returns, the routine is corrected, the noise quiets down, the land is treated with care again. The implication is clear and uncomfortable. The gnome isn't evil, it's enforcing terms. And those terms, often centered around thresholds, doors, gates, hearths, wells, barn entrances, root cellars, these are the places where human order meets the raw ground and folklore treats them like pressure points. A gnome doesn't haunt the attic the way a ghost does. It doesn't roam hallways aimlessly. It sticks close to entryways, to storage, to foundations, to places where something can pass from one world to another. In some traditions, the spirit is said to live under the threshold stone itself, meaning every time you enter or leave your home, you cross over it. Every footstep is a reminder of who actually owns the space beneath you. That idea alone is enough to reframe the act of walking through your front door as a kind of negotiation. You're not just coming home, you're passing through someone else's jurisdiction. And as centuries wear on and Christianity spreads deeper into rural life, these beings don't disappear. They get reinterpreted. And that reinterpretation is where the darkness deepens. Spirits that were once morally neutral, capable of kindness and cruelty, start getting framed as suspicious, unclean, possibly demonic. Anything tied too closely to the earth becomes suspect. Anything that predates the church becomes dangerous by default. But instead of erasing the known, this shift intensifies it. Now the stories don't just warn about disrespect, they warn about association. If something lives under your house and you acknowledge it too openly, what does that say about you? If your home is prosperous and others aren't, who or what helped you? The known starts to carry the weight of guilt. Prosperity gained through unseen help always looks like a bargain from the outside. So this is where you start seeing stories where a household spirit turns on its family not because of neglect, but because of betrayal. Someone tells a priest, someone mocks the old ways, someone refuses the offering out of pride or fear. But the response isn't immediate destruction. It's abandonment followed by collapse. The cows stop producing milk, the fields fail, the bread won't rise, illness creeps in, neighbors whisper, the home becomes marked, not haunted, but unlucky. And luck in old rural societies is survival. lose it, everything else follows. The gnome becomes a symbol of a truth people didn't want to say out loud. You can't erase the old agreements without consequences. As folklore moves into mining towns and frontier settlements, the stories adapt again. Here, the gnome sheds its domestic role and becomes something more territorial. Mines are new wounds in the earth, and the beings tied to the underground space don't take kindly to reckless intrusion. Miners speak quietly about knocks heard deep in tunnels where no one should be working, about laughter echoing off stone walls just before a collapse, about small figures seen at the edge of lantern light, never fully illuminated, always retreating deeper into the rock. Sometimes these appearances are treated as warnings. Leave now, turn back, don't dig here. Other times, they're treated as temptations. Guides leading workers toward richer seams, only for the tunnel to cave in behind them. In these stories, the gnome isn't protecting humans, it's protecting the earth. Humans are expendable. What I find unsettling is how often these accounts emphasize intelligence, not animal instinct, but strategy, timing. The gnome doesn't act randomly. It waits until the mine is crowded. It waits until greed is high. It waits until safety precautions are ignored. Then it appears, or makes itself known just long enough to be remembered afterwards. Survivors talk about the feeling of being watched long before anything went wrong, a sense of being evaluated, judged, as if something underground was deciding whether the intrusion had gone too far. The mine becomes less of a workplace and more of a test. Fail it, and the punishment is buried with you. As society modernizes, you'd expect these stories to fade. Electricity lights the dark, industry mechanizes labor, people move away from the land, but something strange happens instead. The gnome doesn't vanish, it fractures. It appears in new forms, stripped of its old explanations, but still clinging to the same behaviors. Small humanoid figures reported near construction sites, near quarries, near railroad cuts, near newly built homes where the ground has been aggressively disturbed. Reports come from people who don't use folklore language at all. They don't say spirit, they don't say guardian, they say something small, something fast, something that didn't feel right. The descriptions are inconsistent but familiar. Squat bodies, disproportionate heads, dark eyes, sudden movement, vanishing into earth or brush, always near places where humans have altered the ground. And the emotional tone of these modern encounters is telling. There's rarely wonder, rarely delight, and always discomfort, fear, a sense of trespassing. Witnesses report feeling like they shouldn't be there, even when they legally own the land, even when they've lived there for years, even when nothing objectively threatening happens. The presence alone is enough to shift the atmosphere, enough to make a place feel wrong, and that's an echo of the old stories. The gnome doesn't need to attack to assert dominance. It just needs to remind you that your claim is superficial. What makes this darker is how often children feature in these accounts, not as targets in a cinematic sense, but as witnesses. Children see what adults dismiss. They notice the small things, the movements near the ground, the faces in places adults don't look anymore. Many modern gnome-like reports start with a child asking a question no one wants to answer. Who is that little man? Why is he under the house? Why does he come out at night? Adults laugh it off. Imagination, shadows, toys, but the behavior continues. The child refuses certain rooms, certain yards, certain corners of the property night after night, and slowly the adults start avoiding those places too. Not because they believe, no, but because something about them feels off. Folklore has always used children as messengers, not because children are magical, but because they haven't learned what not to see yet. There's also a cruelty in some of the later stories that wasn't as prominent in the earlier ones. Gnomes that imitate voices, gnomes that rearrange objects to mimic human behavior, gnomes that seem to enjoy confusion rather than correction. This shift reflects something else changing. The human relationship with the land becoming more extractive, more aggressive, less reciprocal. When the relationship turns one-sided, the story turns hostile. The gnome stops teaching lessons and starts taking pleasure in disruption. That doesn't mean the being itself changed. It means the storyteller did. Fear reshapes memory, and memory reshapes monsters. But what's consistent across all of this, the ancient stories, the mining lore, the modern sightings, is proximity. Gnomes don't wander aimlessly. They stick close to where humans live, work, dig, and store. They don't come from deep wilderness the way forest spirits do. They don't rule mountains the way giants do. They exist in margins, under floors, behind walls, beneath gardens, inside hills that have been hollowed out. They live where human presence is constant but fragile. That's why they're unsettling. You cannot escape them by leaving civilization behind. They are a product of civilization's footprint. Wherever humans settle, something small and old seems to settle beneath them. And maybe that's why the image had to be softened over time. Maybe that's why the lawn ornament exists at all. Because it's easier to laugh at a smiling statue than to sit with the idea that the ground under your home might be listening, that something might be counting your habits. That disrespect doesn't need witnesses to be recorded. The modern gnome, frozen in ceramic with a grin, is folklore in captivity. It's fear, defanged, and sold back as decoration. But the persistence of the joke betrays anxiety. People don't decorate their lawns with things that never scared them, because underneath the paint and the humor, the old shape is still there, small, patient, and rooted, watching the way you treat the space you occupy, watching whether you act like a guest or a conqueror. And the darker story suggests that if you push that relationship too far, if you dismiss the old rules entirely, the response isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just a slow realization that your home no longer feels like it's on your side, that the ground beneath it has stopped cooperating, and something unseen has shifted its attention away from keeping things balanced and toward reminding you that the balance was never optional in the first place. So since the rules were never announced, that's the first thing the old stories make clear, and it's what makes breaking them so dangerous. There is never no list nailed to the door, no warnings carved into the threshold. The gnome doesn't introduce itself and explain expectations. The rules exist the way gravity exists, quiet, constant, unforgiving. You learn them by watching what works and what doesn't, by noticing patterns before you notice consequences. And when those patterns are ignored, the response doesn't come as a lesson, it comes as correction. One of the oldest taboos centers on mockery, not disbelief, mockery. The stories draw a sharp line between skepticism and disrespect. You're allowed to doubt. You're allowed to question. What you are not allowed to do is laugh. Not at the land, not at the unseen, not at the idea that something might be watching. Mockery is treated like an insult delivered directly to something that can't answer you out loud, but can answer you later. In the folklore, households where jokes are made about the little man don't immediately fall apart. That would be too obvious. Instead, the home becomes unpredictable. Food spoils faster than it should. Nails bend when hammered. Wood splits wrong. Repairs never quite fix the problem they're meant to fix. It's as if the space itself has decided to stop cooperating. The lesson isn't pain, it's humiliation. You can't even keep your own house in order anymore. And noise, that is another line that shows up again and again. Loud voices near the hearth, singing after dark, whistling at night, laughing in the cellar. These behaviors aren't framed as sinful. They're framed as careless. The gnome is said to prefer routine sounds, the cackle of fire, the scrape of the broom, the low murmur of conversation. Noise that announces itself feels like a challenge. In some accounts, whistling is treated as the worst offense of all. It's described as a signal, an invitation, a call that draws attention where it isn't wanted. Homes where people whistle after sunset report disturbances that begin within days. Scratching in the wall, knocking under the floor, a presence pacing beneath the boards, not attacking, asserting, letting you know you've been heard. Then there's waste. Waste is unforgivable, right? Get that down, people. Spoiled food thrown away without acknowledgement. Here's some examples. Milk poured out carelessly, bread discarded when it could have been eaten. In agriculture societies, waste was already a moral failure. In gnome lore, it becomes a personal offense. You are taking more from the land than you respect the land, right? And the punishment for waste isn't scarcity, it's excess that turns against you. Food rots faster, milk curdles instantly, crops grow misshapen, animals eat and don't thrive. It's not starvation, it's mockery. And remember that abundance without gratitude is hollow. And in the middle of all this, guess what? Offerings sit at the center of all these rules, but they're misunderstood now. An offering is not a payment, it's acknowledgement. A quiet nod to the fact that you are not alone in the space you occupy. And the worst mistake people make in the stories is stopping the offering abruptly. Not forgetting once, not missing a night, but stopping. The tone of those accounts changes sharply. Where early disturbances were irritating, the response to a withdrawn offering is personal. Objects moved deliberately. Tools placed where they'll cause injury, small traps made from ordinary household items, things that trip, snag, cut. The gnome's intelligence becomes impossible to deny. This isn't a force of nature anymore. It's a presence that noticed a pattern change and decided to respond. There are also rules tied to renovation. And this is where folklore starts to feel uncomfortably modern. Digging without acknowledgement, moving foundation stones, filling in old wells, cutting down trees that have stood longer than the house itself. In older accounts, these acts aren't evil, but they're dangerous. They require permission, not spoken but earned through care. When these boundaries are ignored, the consequences escalate. Sudden accidents during constructions, tool malfunctioning, nails puncturing tires, ladders slipping for no clear reason, and at night, when the work stops, the sounds begin. Dragging beneath the floor, scraping against stone, something rearranging what was just built as if to say, this isn't staying the way you want it to. Children are again the ones who notice first. They refuse to sleep in rooms that didn't bother them before. They complain about someone being under the house, not a monster, not a ghost, someone. Small, busy, angry. Parents tell them it's the pipes, animals, imagination, all that jazz, right? But the behavior continues, and it's always specific. The same corner, the same time of night, the same sound. Children don't describe rage the way adults do. They describe irritation. They say it feels like something is annoyed, like something is tired of being ignored. One of the most unsettling taboo involves naming. In some traditions, speaking directly about the household spirit invites attention. You don't say what it is. You do not speculate out loud. You do not point and question its space. You speak around it. You acknowledge without confronting. Homes where people argue loudly about whether something is real report a sharp increase in activity, as if the debate itself has taken provocation. But the message is clear. You're discussing something that presents as if it doesn't. And then there are the rules no one likes to talk about because they feel cruel. Rules about territory, about knowing where you belong. In some stories, gnomes respond harshly when humans expand too aggressively, claiming more land, fencing off more space, digging deeper, louder, wider than before. The retaliation isn't fire or flood, it's misdirection. People get lost on their own property, paths feel unfamiliar, distances seem longer than they are. A barn that stood for decades suddenly feels wrong to enter. This isn't physical harm, it's disorientation. A psychological reminder that the land doesn't recognize your maps. And to top it all off, breaking one of these rules doesn't lead to one dramatic punishment. It leads to a shift. The home stops feeling like a refuge. People sleep poorly, arguments increase, pets act skittish, guests comment that the place feels off, right? Nothing supernatural enough to point at, though. Nothing dramatic enough to call for help. Just a slow erosion of comfort. That's the most effective consequence of all. People will tolerate fear. They won't tolerate unease because unease makes you leave. But even in the darkest version of these stories, the final consequence isn't retaliation, it's inheritance. The gnome doesn't punish, it waits. It lets the family tear itself apart. It lets neglect compound. It lets the house decay. And when the people finally leave, when the property is abandoned, sold, forgotten, the presence remains. New owners move in and fill it immediately. The cycle starts again. Different people, same rules, same consequences. The land remembers even when people don't. What makes this intimate is how ordinary it all is. No grand rituals, no summoning circles, no dramatic bargainings. Just daily life lives slightly wrong, slightly louder, slightly greedier, slightly more careless, and something small notices. Something patient keeps track. Something tied to the ground beneath your feet. Wait until your routine slips up far enough out of balance to justify its actions against you. The gnome doesn't need belief, right? It doesn't need worship. It doesn't even need fear. It responds to behavior, to patterns, to the way you move through your own space, to whether you act like the place you live in is alive or you act like it's just an object waiting to be used. And once that judgment is made, the response isn't dramatic. It's persistent. It's intimate. It's the kind of correction that follows you from room to room, night after night, until you start changing things without fully understanding why. Because the oldest rule of all, the one no story ever states outright, is this: the land doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It observes. And once you've been noticed, the only question left is how long it takes you to realize that the rules were always there, whether you acknowledge them or not. So I'm sure you're asking yourself, well, what about these modern accounts, right? The ones that people have been reporting. most recently. So in the modern accounts, right, the language changes first. People don't reach for folklore terms. They don't say spirit or guardian or anything that sounds rehearsed. They hesitate. They circle what they're trying to describe. They use the phrase like something small or a little guy or I know how this sounds, but the tone isn't wonder, it's discomfort, embarrassment, a sense that whatever they saw doesn't fit into any category they're allowed to talk about openly. These aren't campfire stories. They're confessions made quietly, usually after a pause, usually after someone has decided you won't laugh at them. And that's true with any kind of cryptid or paranormal encounter. If someone decides that you won't laugh at them, they're going to tell you their story. So, a lot of these modern reports come from rural properties. Places where the ground is still worked, still dug into, still reshaped by hand and machine. New homes built on old land, additions poured onto existing foundations, septic systems cut into soil that hasn't been disturbed in generations. People talk about things starting almost immediately after work begins. Immediately. Not dramatic hauntings, just interference. Tools going missing on site, equipment failing for no clear reason, survey stakes pulled out and stacked neatly overnight, trenches collapsing in sections that were shored correctly the day before, workers hearing movement beneath them when no one else is below grade. The explanation is always mechanical until it isn't, until the same problem repeats too often, until the work slows down not because of budget or weather, but because something keeps getting in the way. Construction crews, especially in rural areas, tend to be blunt about these things. They don't romanticize, they don't embellish. They say things like, there's something wrong with this spot, and refuses to work past sunset. They talk about seeing movement near the ground that's too fast for an animal and too deliberate to be debris. Small shapes darting behind stacks of lumber, something crouched near a foundation trench that vanishes when looked at directly. The descriptions are inconsistent in detail, but consistent in scale. Short, compact, low to the ground, always close to where the earth has been opened, always gone before anyone can point it out to someone else. But the homeowners, let's not forget about them. Homeowners tell quieter stories. They start with renovations, a remodel, an extension, digging out a crawl space, leveling a yard. They describe how the house felt different afterward, not haunted, off, sounds changing, footsteps where there shouldn't be any, scraping beneath the floors that aren't supposed to have an open space under them, children asking questions that don't have comfortable answers. Who's fixing things at night? Why does the floor talk? Why can't we go under the house anymore? Adults brush it off, but the questions keep coming and the behaviors escalate, just enough to be noticed. Items moved deliberately, not lost, placed. Tools arranged in lines, shoes turned around, food going bad faster than it should, animals refusing certain rooms or areas of the yard. There are a lot of reports from rural Texas, Appalachia, the Pacific Northwest, the desert Southwest places where land is still treated as something active, something that can fight back if pushed too hard. People describe seeing small figures near tree lines or at rock piles at dusk. They don't approach, they don't wave, they watch. The witnesses often feel an immediate sense of intrusion. They feel like they've walked into something they weren't meant to see. The figure moves quickly, not fleeing so much as repositioning, slipping behind cover that shouldn't hide something that size completely. And then it's gone. No chase, no pursuit, just absence. What lingers is the feeling of being evaluated. Miners and quarry workers who still talk about this, though most of it stays off the record, heavy equipment operators hearing knocks from inside solid rock, not echoing noises, distinct taps, rhythmic, intentional warnings of mockery, depending on how close the job is to a collapse. Some crews leave offerings without naming them as such, food left at the edge of a site, tools placed carefully instead of tossed, quiet adopted without discussion. Work resumes more smoothly afterwards, not because anyone admits belief, but because enough people have learned not to test whatever patience exists beneath them. There are also accounts from people living near abandoned industrial sites, old mines, old mills, old quarries, etc., that have been reclaimed by vegetation, but not by peace. People report movement near collapsed entrances, small figures slipping into openings too narrow for adults or animals, sounds of activity underground long after operations ended. In some cases, attempts to seal or redevelop these sites are met with repeated setbacks, machine failure, worker injuries that feel oddly avoidable in hindsight, a sense that the site itself resists closure, that something prefers it unsettled. Children, again, they play a strange role in these modern accounts. They describe figures that adults never quite see in time. They give them practical names, the dirt man, the little worker, the one under the house. They don't describe it as fear, they describe it as annoyance. He doesn't like it when we're loud. He doesn't like it when you move things. Over time, that annoyance shifts into avoidance. Children stop playing in certain areas. They insist doors stay closed. They react strongly to changes in routine. Adults chalk it up to imagination until enough patterns stack up that ignoring it becomes harder than acknowledging it privately. What's striking is how many of these modern encounters end the same way. Not with an exorcism, not with proof, with behavioral change. Construction slows or stops, renovation plans are altered, offerings again, never named, appeared. A bowl of food left outside, a quiet adopted at night, a decision made not to expand further, and after that, the activity tapers off. Not immediately, but gradually. Like something satisfied enough to stop pushing back, the space settles, the house feels stable again, people sleep better, animals calm down, and no one talks about why. In other cases, the ending is simpler. People leave. They sell the property, they abandon the project, they move away from the land entirely, and the reports stop because the witnesses are gone. Not because the presence is. New owners arrive, a new story begins, and guess what, folks? The cycle resets. But what makes these modern accounts so unsettling isn't their intensity, it's their restraint. There's no spectacle, no demand for attention, just a persistent sense of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, of having crossed an invisible line without knowing it was there, of realizing that despite of all our technology, all of our lighting, all of our documentation, we still disturb the same ground our ancestors did. And sometimes the ground responds in the same quiet ways. People want these encounters to be something else. Hallucinations, stress, wildlife, mechanical noise. Anything that fits inside an acceptable explanation. But the consistency is hard to ignore. Small figures close to the ground, near disturbed soil, appeared during periods of change, interfering rather than attacking. Withdrawing once behavior shifts, that pattern is old. Older than the language people now use to describe it. And that's the part that stays with witnesses the longest. Not fear, not certainty, but the lingering suspicion that whatever they encountered didn't care whether it was believed in or not, that it wasn't trying to convince or convert, it was responding, watching what people did, adjusting its behavior accordingly, as if the rules were still in effect even now, even here, even when no one remembers ever agreeing with them. So eventually, in many of these places, something changes. Not because anyone announces it, not because there's a clear moment where a problem is solved, but because the pressure eases, the sound stops, the movement ceases, the night grows still again. People describe it the same way every time, with the same uncertain language. They don't say the presence left. They say things like, it's settled, or it backed off, or things just went quiet. Quiet in these stories is not a relief, it's an adjustment, a recalibration of sorts, like a machine that has stopped vibrating after being forced too hard for too long. Homes that were once restless begin to behave normally again. Floors stop creaking at night, tools stay where they're put, animals relax, children stop asking questions, sleep returns in shallow increments at first, then more deeply. And no one celebrates, no one marks the moment. There's an instinctive understanding that drawing attention to the change would be a mistake. Silence becomes something to protect rather than feel. People lower their voices without discussing it. They stop working late. They don't push the land any further than necessary. They don't test whether the quiet is permanent. What's unsettling is how often this silence arrives without explanation. There's no final sign, no last warning, no dramatic departure. The activity simply ends, right? As if whatever was there decided that the point has been made, or as if the conditions that drew attention in the first place had finally shifted enough to make further action unnecessary. The lack of closure is intentional. These stories don't reward curiosity, they reward restraint, and silence in that context feels less like safety and more like a truce. In abandoned places, the quiet carries a different weight. Old houses where no one lives anymore, properties sold and resold until the history blurs, industrial sites left to rust and overgrow. People report that these places feel watched even when nothing happens. No sounds, no movement, just a sense of presence without engagement. As if whatever remains there has no reason to interact anymore. No routines to correct, no boundaries being crossed. Silence becomes a sign, not of peace, but irrelevance. There is a recurring detail in these accounts that rarely gets emphasized, but lingers if you listen closely. When activities stop, people don't feel victorious, they feel cautious. They don't talk about what they've experienced openly. They don't seek validation. They don't try to prove anything. They adjust their lives quietly and move on, as if whatever happened taught them something they don't want to put into words. Something about limits, about paying attention, about how easily ordinary life can be disrupted when the ground beneath it stops cooperating. Silence also changes how people perceive their space. Homes that once felt owned begin to feel shared, not in a threatening way, in a humbling one. People become more careful without knowing why. They waste less, they fix things properly instead of rushing. They stop expanding, they stop digging, stop pushing. The land becomes something to live with rather than on. And the absence of disturbance reinforces the behavior. Quiet rewards restraint. What lingers longest is the question people just don't ask out loud. Not was it real, but what made it stop? Was it compliance? Was it patience? Was it simply time? Or did whatever was there just lose interest and turn its attention elsewhere? These stories never answer that. They let the uncertainty sit because certainty invites confidence and confidence invites mistakes. In some places, years pass without incident. Families forgot why they stopped certain habits. New routines become normal. Children grow up without knowing why certain rules exist in the house. We don't go under there. We don't make noise at night. We don't mess with that part of the yard. The rules survive even when the reasons fade and the silence holds. That more than anything is what these stories leave behind. Not fear, not belief, not proof, just awareness. The sense that quiet isn't empty, that stillness doesn't mean nothing is there, that withdrawal can be a response as deliberate as interface. The ground beneath the home doesn't need to announce itself to remain present. It just needs to be remembered. Because when something tied to a place goes silent, it doesn't mean it's gone. It means the interaction has ended for now. And the people who lived through that transition tend to treat the silence with the same respect they once gave the disturbance. They don't ask for more. They don't push for answers. They let the quiet remain intact. And maybe that's the last rule, the one that never gets spoken. When the land stops responding, you don't demand an explanation. You listen. You keep living. You leave things as they are, and you accept that some relationships aren't meant to be resolved, only observed, adjusted to, and carried quietly into the night, where silence doesn't promise safety, only balance. If you've listened this far, take a moment before you move on, not to decide what you believe, not to explain anything away, just to notice your space, the sounds in your home, the way the floor feels under your feet. Stories like this don't ask for belief, they ask for attention. And this has been Highway of the Hidden. I'm your host, Polar Bear. And if you've experienced anything similar, or if you've experienced a creature, cryptid, paranormal, or you just want to come talk about conspiracies, you can reach me at polarbearhoth@gmail.com, TikTok and Instagram, polarbearhoth, Facebook, Highway of the Hidden. Until next time, travel carefully, folks, and be safe out there.
And as the road disappears into the mist, the hidden waits for those brave enough to follow. Until next time, keep your eyes on the shadows and remember, every highway has its secrets. This has been Highway of the Hidden.